The forbidden touch. David adjusted the straps on his uniform, his heart pounding as he stepped into the grand hall of the Zyran Palace. The room was massive, its ceiling glowing with soft golden lights. Alien symbols flickered across the tall, curved walls, whispering stories of ancient power. Zyran warriors, tall and broad-shouldered, stood in perfect formation, their sharp eyes locked onto him. They didn't trust humans, and David could feel it in their stares. He had been sent as part of Earth's first diplomatic mission to the Zyran Empire. Humanity had just discovered them, a powerful alien race with strict traditions and laws. If this meeting went well, Earth could secure a new alliance. If it went badly, well, he didn't want to think about that. At the center of the hall sat Princess Zyra, heir to the Zyran throne. Her deep violet eyes studied him with curiosity and disdain. She wore a flowing battle robe, marked with golden patterns that pulsed faintly. Unlike other Zyran, her markings glowed softly, almost hypnotic. She was powerful, and she knew it. David stepped forward, bowing slightly. "I am honored to be here, Princess Zyra." Her expression didn't change. "We shall see if you are worthy of honor, human." The tension in the room was thick. David kept his posture straight, reminding himself not to make any mistakes. The Zyran were proud warriors. One wrong move, one disrespectful act, and this mission would fail. As he took another step, his foot caught the edge of a stone tile. He lost balance, just for a second, but in that moment, his hand brushed against Zyra's arm. The hall fell into dead silence. Every Zyran warrior stiffened. The council members watching from the side gasped. A guard took a step forward, gripping the hilt of his blade. David felt the weight of 100 eyes burning into him. He had no idea what he had just done, but the reaction told him it was bad. Zyra's markings flashed bright red, a color that hadn't appeared before. Her expression shifted from shock to fury. She jerked back as if burned. "You." Her voice was sharp, her fists clenched. "You touched me." David took a cautious step back. It was an accident. One of the Zyran elders, a towering figure with silver hair, stepped forward. His face was pale. "Human, do you understand what you have done?" David swallowed hard. I don't understand." The elder's voice was grim. "Among our people, physical touch bonds us. It is a sacred law. A law that cannot be broken." David's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Wait, what do you mean by bonds?" Zyra's markings pulsed again, her jaw tight with rage. "It means, human, that you are now my fated mate." David blinked. His brain struggled to process her words. "What?" The entire room erupted into chaos. Some warriors shouted in protest. Others murmured in shock. The council members exchanged tense glances. The guards moved closer, their weapons half drawn. Zyra turned to the elder. "This is unacceptable. He is a human. He cannot be my mate." The elder's face remained grim. "The law is absolute, Princess. Once a Zyran's markings change, the bond is sealed. It cannot be undone." David's mouth went dry. "Fated mate. This had to be a mistake. I didn't mean to do anything," he protested. Zyra whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "You think that matters. You broke the law, and now I am bound to you." David opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, guards grabbed his arms. "You will be taken to the holding chambers," the elder announced, "until the council decides what is to be done with you." "Wait, hold on." David struggled, but the guards were strong. "This is a misunderstanding. You can't just." Zyra stepped closer, her voice low and dangerous. "You better pray, human, that they find a way to fix this. Because if they don't..." She leaned in, her breath warm against his skin. "You belong to me now." David's stomach twisted. This was not how the mission was supposed to go. As the guards dragged him away, one thought burned in his mind. How the hell was he supposed to get out of this? The unbreakable bond. David sat in the cold, dimly lit chamber, his mind racing. The Zyran holding cell was nothing like the prisons on Earth. The walls shimmered with a strange energy field, humming softly like a living thing. There were no bars, no visible doors, just a force field separating him from the outside world. He had tried touching it once. His fingers had burned instantly, and the pain still lingered. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what had just happened. Fated mate. Bonded. This wasn't just a cultural misunderstanding. This was something far more dangerous. The door slid open with a sharp hiss, and Princess Zyra stepped inside. David stood up immediately, his muscles tensing. Zyra's violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, her expression unreadable. She was still furious, but beneath her anger, there was something else, something she was trying to hide. "You," she said, her voice like ice, "our problem." David crossed his arms. "Yeah. Well, this wasn't exactly on my to-do list either." Zyra's markings flickered, as if reacting to his words. She let out a frustrated breath and began pacing. "This bond should not exist," she muttered. "It is meant for warriors, for those chosen by destiny, not for a human." David narrowed his eyes. "You keep saying bond. What does it actually mean?" Zyra stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. "Among my people, the bond is sacred. It connects two souls. Permanently." David's stomach dropped. "Wait. Permanently. As in forever." Zyra's jaw tightened. "Yes. And worse, it strengthens over time." David stared at her. "So what happens if we ignore it? Pretend it doesn't exist?" Zyra let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that simple? No. The bond will pull at us, it will grow, and if left unchecked, it will consume us both." David swallowed hard. That didn't sound good. "What does that mean?" he asked carefully. Zyra hesitated before answering. "At first, it starts small. We will feel each other's presence, our emotions, but as time passes, the bond will demand acknowledgement. If we resist, it will turn into pain. Physical, mental, until one of us breaks." David's pulse quickened. "You're telling me this thing could kill us?" Zyra crossed her arms. "If left completely unchecked, yes." David let out a slow breath, his mind spinning. This wasn't just some weird alien custom. This was real. A living force inside them. "So, what's the solution?" he asked. Zyra's expression darkened. "There are only two ways to resolve a bond." David nodded, urging her to continue. "First," she said, "we accept it." David frowned. "And what does that mean exactly?" Zyra's eyes held his, unblinking. "We would be mates. Officially. Completely." David's heart pounded. He barely knew this woman, and now the universe wanted to tie their souls together forever. That was insane. "Okay," he said carefully, "what's option 2? Zyra's expression turned cold. "The second option is death." David blinked. "Excuse me?" Zyra stepped closer, her voice softer but deadly. "The bond cannot be undone. If one of us dies, the bond dies with us." A chill ran down David's spine. He looked into her violet eyes, searching for any sign that she was joking. She wasn't. "So that's it," he said, voice tense. "Marry me or kill me." Zyra tilted her head. "You misunderstand. I do not need to kill you." David stiffened. "Then who does?" Zyra sighed, as if the answer was obvious. "The Council. They see this bond as a threat. A human cannot be part of our royal bloodline." David clenched his fists. "So what? They'll just execute me?" Zyra nodded. "Unless you prove yourself worthy." David's eyebrows shot up. "Worthy? Of what?" Zyra's markings flashed again. "The Council has agreed to a trial. If you pass, they will allow the bond to remain. If you fail, She didn't need to finish the sentence. David already knew what it meant. He let out a slow breath. All right. What kind of trial are we talking about? Zaira hesitated for the first time. It is not meant for humans. David smirked, despite himself. That's funny, because neither is this whole situation. Zaira narrowed her eyes. This is not a joke. The trial of fire is the test of a warrior. It will push you beyond your limits. David took a step forward. Then I'll do it. Zaira's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze, something he couldn't quite read. You should know, she said. No outsider has ever survived it. David exhaled sharply. Great, that makes me feel much better. Zaira turned toward the door, but stopped before leaving. She didn't look back, but her voice was quieter this time. You have 3 days to prepare. If you die in the trial, at least it will be an honorable death. The door hissed shut behind her. David sat back down, rubbing his hands over his face. 3 days. He had 3 days to survive a test built for alien warriors. He let out a nervous laugh. This mission had gone so far off the rails, he couldn't even see the tracks anymore. But one thing was clear. If he wanted to live, he had to fight. Warrior training begins. David stood in the middle of the training arena, sweat dripping down his face. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of burning metal and the faint hum of Zairan energy fields. Around him, massive stone pillars glowed with ancient runes, each one pulsing with a strange golden light. This was where warriors were forged, and where weaklings were broken. Zaira stood across from him, arms crossed, watching him like a predator sizing up its prey. She was not impressed. This is pointless, she said, voice sharp. You're human. You cannot train like us. You do not have the strength, the endurance, or the reflexes to survive the trial of fire. David wiped his forehead and gave her a half smile. Well, lucky for me. I don't need your approval. Just need to survive. Zaira's markings flared in irritation. She hated his confidence. She turned to the warriors standing along the edges of the training grounds. They were Zairan elites, battle-hardened fighters who had survived countless wars. Each of them was at least a foot taller than David, their bodies sculpted like living weapons. This is General Reichel, Zaira said, motioning to the largest of them. The Zairan warrior stepped forward, his armor plated with obsidian black metal, his piercing red eyes locked onto David. He will train you, Zaira continued, or break you. Reichel didn't bother with introductions. He reached forward and punched David straight in the gut. David gasped as pain exploded through his ribs. He flew backward, landing hard on the stone floor. He barely had time to roll before another blow came. Reichel moved like a monster, fast and brutal. His next strike was aimed at David's head. A single deadly punch meant to end the fight before it even began. David reacted purely on instinct. He twisted to the side, barely dodging the attack, and lashed out with a counter-strike. His fist connected with Reichel's armored chest. Nothing happened. Reichel didn't even flinch. David had just punched what felt like a steel wall. The Zairan general backhanded him across the face, sending him skidding across the ground. Blood filled David's mouth. Zaira sighed. Pathetic. David coughed, struggling to push himself up. His body ached, but he wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. This, all you got, he muttered, spitting blood onto the ground. The warriors around them laughed. Even Reichel smirked. Zaira, however, was watching him carefully. David shouldn't have been able to stand after that hit. His body was weaker than theirs, his bones more fragile. But something in him refused to break. Maybe it was the bond. Maybe it was just his own damn stubbornness. Either way, Zaira found herself curious. She stepped forward, stopping just inches from David. He looked up at her, breathing hard. You don't have the strength to match us, she said. But perhaps you can fight differently. David wiped his mouth and smirked. Oh, you mean like fighting smart? Zyra's eyes narrowed, but she didn't deny it. Humans are weak, but they are adaptable. Perhaps you can learn. She turned back to Reichel. Again. David barely had time to react before Reichel attacked once more. But this time, David was ready. The next phase of training. For the next 2 days, David trained harder than he ever had in his life. He learned quickly that trying to match Zyron's strength was impossible. Instead, he focused on speed, strategy, and endurance. Reichel beat him down again and again, but each time, David adapted. He studied how the Zyron warriors moved, how they attacked, how they left themselves open for even the smallest fraction of a second. By the end of the first day, he had lasted 5 minutes against Reichel before getting knocked out. By the second day, he landed his first successful hit. And by the third day, something unexpected happened. David dodged a full-power Zyron attack. It wasn't luck. It wasn't by accident. He saw the attack coming. He predicted it. And when Reichel swung at him with a devastating punch, David sidestepped at the last second, using the Zyron's own momentum against him. For the first time, Reichel stumbled. The entire arena went silent. Zyra's eyes widened. David exhaled, a grin spreading across his bruised face. "Ha! Would you look at that?" Reichel turned toward him, wiping blood from his lip. And then he laughed. Deep, guttural, approving. "The human learns," he rumbled. "Perhaps he is not completely worthless after all." David rolled his shoulders. "I'll take that as a compliment." Zyra stepped forward, studying him with a strange expression. "You are not strong like us," she said slowly. "But you are something else." David tilted his head. "And what's that?" Zyra hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, she muttered, "Unpredictable." David grinned. "I'll take it." A deadly warning. That night, after training, David sat alone in his chamber, wrapping his bruised knuckles with cloth. His body ached everywhere, but he had made it. He had proven himself. A soft click came from the door. David's instincts flared. He turned just in time to see a shadow move. A knife flashed in the dim light. David rolled off the bed, the blade barely missing his throat. The assassin struck again, fast and silent. David grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisting it hard. The assassin hissed in pain and yanked back, flipping away. David's heart pounded. This wasn't just any assassin. This was a Zyron warrior. Someone wanted him dead before the trial even began. Before David could react, the assassin vanished through the doorway, disappearing into the night. David stood there, breathing hard. Then, the realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about the trial. Someone didn't want him to survive long enough to take it. He was being hunted. And if he wasn't careful, he wouldn't live to see the next sunrise. The deadly trial. David stood at the edge of the Zyron arena, staring at the battlefield that would decide his fate. The trial of fire. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. A massive, circular coliseum, surrounded by towering stone walls etched with ancient carvings. Strange alien runes flickered in the dim light, shifting and pulsing like they were alive. The ground was covered in black volcanic rock, still radiating heat, making the air shimmer with waves of distortion. In the stands above, thousands of Zyron warriors watched in silence, their piercing eyes locked onto him, some filled with amusement, others with disdain. They weren't here to see a human succeed. They were here to watch him fail. Zyra stood among the royal council, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She was watching, too. David clenched his fists, forcing himself to ignore the weight of their stares. He had survived training. He had survived an assassination attempt. Now he had to survive this. A deep voice echoed across the arena. "The trial begins. Bring out the challengers." The arena gates groaned open, and out stepped 3 Zyron warriors. David exhaled sharply. He had expected 1 opponent, maybe 2. But 3? Each warrior towered over him, their skin marked with glowing red runes. Their bodies were covered in battle-scarred armor, weapons gleaming under the fiery glow of the arena. These weren't just any warriors. They were blood-born gladiators, Zyran warriors who had fought and survived countless battles, their skills honed through years of brutal combat. David swallowed hard. He was screwed. Round 1. Strength against strategy. The first warrior attacked without warning. A massive Zyran male lunged at David with inhuman speed, swinging a bladed gauntlet aimed straight for his throat. David barely dodged in time, rolling to the side as the blade sliced through the air where his head had just been. Before he could recover, the warrior was already moving again, this time faster, deadlier. David's instincts screamed. He had no choice. He fought back. David ducked under the next attack and struck out with a well-placed kick to the warrior's knee. Nothing. The Zyran barely flinched. David's mind raced. He couldn't overpower them, but he could outthink them. The warrior lunged again, but this time, David didn't dodge. Instead, he sidestepped at the last second, letting the Zyran's momentum carry him forward, straight into a jagged rock formation. The impact shattered the stone. The warrior groaned, stunned for a split second. That was all David needed. He grabbed a nearby metal staff from the ground and drove it into the warrior's side. The weapon hit a weak spot in the armor, and the Zyran stumbled, gasping. David didn't stop. He drove his elbow into the warrior's head, then spun behind him and yanked his leg out from under him. The massive alien crashed to the ground. The crowd gasped. David stood over his fallen opponent, panting. 1 down. But he barely had time to process his small victory before the second warrior attacked. Round 2. The Berserker. The second warrior was different. He was faster, stronger. Before David could react, the Zyran slammed into him like a charging bull, knocking him off his feet. David hit the ground hard, pain exploding in his ribs. The air rushed out of his lungs. The warrior loomed over him, his massive war hammer raised high. David's survival instincts kicked in. He rolled out of the way just as the hammer crashed down, splitting the ground where he had been lying. He barely had time to recover before the warrior swung again. David ducked, dodged, and weaved between the relentless attacks, using every ounce of speed he had. But he was slowing down, getting tired. The Zyran wasn't. The next attack came too fast. David tried to dodge, but the hammer clipped his side, sending him sprawling. Pain flared through his ribs. His vision blurred. The warrior loomed over him again, lifting the hammer for a final, crushing blow. David's mind raced. He had one shot. He grabbed a handful of volcanic ash from the ground and threw it into the warrior's face. The Zyran roared, stumbling backward, temporarily blinded. David seized the opening. He launched himself forward, driving his knee into the warrior's chest. The impact sent the Zyran toppling over the edge of a lava pit. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. David staggered to his feet, chest heaving. 2 down. 1 to go. Round 3. The Silent Assassin. The final warrior didn't attack. He simply watched. David narrowed his eyes, keeping his stance firm. This one was different. Smaller than the others, more agile, more dangerous. The warrior suddenly vanished. David barely had time to react before something slammed into his back, knocking him forward. Then, pain. A thin blade sliced across his arm. David stumbled, gripping his wound. The assassin reappeared a few feet away, holding a curved dagger coated in a glowing green liquid. Poison. David's heart pounded. If he got cut again, he wouldn't survive. The assassin attacked, faster than anything David had ever seen. David dodged. Barely. Another attack. David blocked, but the force sent him skidding backward. He was losing. The poison was slowing him down. His vision blurred. The assassin lunged again, going for a killing strike. David had one chance. He dropped low, avoiding the blade by inches, then drove his fist into the assassin's ribs. The Zyran staggered. David didn't stop. He grabbed the assassin's wrist and twisted it, forcing the dagger out of his hand. Then, he turned the blade on him. The poisoned dagger sank into the assassin's chest. The Zyran gasped. David let go, watching as the last warrior fell. The arena was silent. Then, the crowd erupted in cheers. Victory and a new threat. David stood in the center of the battlefield, breathing hard. He had done it. He had survived. Zyra watched from the royal balcony, her markings glowing faintly. For the first time, she looked at him not with disdain, but with something else. Respect. But before David could even catch his breath, the council elder stood up. "The human has survived the trial," he announced, "but his place among us is not yet secure." David's stomach dropped. "What now?" he muttered. The elder's gaze darkened. "There is one final test." David clenched his fists. Of course there was, and something told him this one would be far worse. The betrayal and the escape. The cheers still echoed through the Grand Zyran arena when the Elder Council stood, their expressions grim. David, bruised and breathing heavily, glanced up at them, his muscles aching from the battle. He had won. He had passed the trial of fire. But something in the air felt wrong. Princess Zyra stood at the royal balcony, watching him, her violet eyes locked onto his. She didn't look pleased. She looked tense. Then the Elder Council elder raised his hand, and the crowd's cheers fell into silence. "The human has survived the trial," the elder announced, "but survival alone does not grant him a place among us." David's jaw clenched. "You've got to be kidding me." The elder continued, his voice echoing across the Colosseum. "The bond that has formed between the princess and this human is unnatural. It is an insult to our traditions. Therefore, the council has reached a final decision." David braced himself. "The human will be executed." For a moment, the world stopped. The crowd murmured in confusion. Even some of the warriors who had watched him fight looked surprised. David's blood went cold. "What?" The elder's expression remained unyielding. "The law states that a fated mate must be worthy. And no matter how well you fought today, you are still human." A deep rage burned in David's chest. He had risked everything. He had survived. And now, they wanted to kill him anyway. "This is madness," he shouted, his voice carrying across the arena. "I fought your warriors. I passed your trial. What else do you want from me?" Zyra moved. For the first time, she stepped forward, her body tense with barely contained fury. "You promised," she said, her voice cold. "You promised the trial would decide his fate. If he survived, he would be one of us." The elder turned to her, his expression calm. "We never promised anything, Princess. We simply allowed the trial to proceed. We never said the outcome would change the law." Zyra's markings flared dangerously. "You are twisting our traditions." "Tradition is what keeps our people strong." The elder's voice was firm. "And an outsider in our royal bloodline will only weaken us." David took a step forward, adrenaline surging. His mind was already racing for an escape. Then, he heard it. A sound behind him. A blade being drawn. He turned just in time to see a Zyran warrior lunging at him. David dodged, barely avoiding the strike, but another warrior was already closing in. It was an ambush. The crowd did nothing. The Zyran did nothing. This wasn't a fair fight anymore. This was an execution. David acted on pure instinct. He grabbed the arm of the first warrior, twisting it sharply. The blade dropped. In the same motion, David snatched it out of the air and drove his elbow into the warrior's ribs, sending him stumbling back. The second warrior lunged. David ducked under the attack and slammed the hilt of the blade into his opponent's throat. The warrior choked, staggering. The arena erupted into chaos. Guards flooded the battlefield. The council shouted for order. The crowd gasped. David backed away, his mind running through his options. He had none. He couldn't win. He couldn't fight an entire army. And then, a voice rang out. "Stop, Zyra." David turned. The princess stood between him and the approaching guards. Her violet eyes burned with defiance. "You will not kill him." The elder narrowed his eyes. "Princess, step aside." "No." Gasps rippled through the crowd. David barely had time to process it before Zyra turned and grabbed his wrist. The moment her skin touched his, her markings pulsed bright red. The elders staggered back in shock. The bond was strengthening. David felt something pull at his mind. A strange warmth spread through his chest. He wasn't sure if it was magic or something else, but it was real. Zyra tightened her grip. "We're leaving." David's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Zyra didn't answer. Instead, she ripped a ceremonial staff from one of the guards and swung it in a wide arc, knocking 3 of them to the ground. Then she turned to him. "Run." David didn't ask twice. The escape begins. They sprinted through the underground corridors of the palace. Behind them, alarms blared. Guards shouted orders. The entire Zyran capital was on high alert. David glanced at Zyra as they ran. "Are you seriously doing this? Turning against your own people?" Zyra's jaw was tight. "They turned against me first." A blast of energy slammed into the wall beside them, sending sparks flying. David cursed. The guards were catching up. "Where are we going?" he panted. "There's a ship hidden in the lower docks," Zyra said. "If we can reach it, we can escape the city." David's adrenaline surged. And then what? Zyra didn't answer, because she didn't know. They turned a corner, only to be met with a line of armed guards blocking their path. David skidded to a halt. "Well, that's not good." Zyra raised her staff. "Stay close." Before David could react, she launched herself forward. Zyra moved like a storm, her strikes precise and brutal. She disarmed the first guard with a single motion, spun, and knocked another unconscious. David took the chance to grab a fallen weapon. He blocked an attack from one of the guards, twisted around, and landed a well-placed kick to his opponent's knee. Zyra finished off the last guard with a final devastating blow. The path was clear. David exhaled. "Remind me to never fight you." Zyra grabbed his wrist again. "Move." They ran through the final stretch of the corridor, reaching the docking bay. A sleek black Zyran starship was already prepped for takeoff. David's eyes widened. "Please tell me you know how to fly that thing." Zyra's lips twitched. "Better than you." She pulled him inside. The hatch sealed shut. The ship's engines roared to life. The moment they lifted off, the palace doors burst open, and dozens of Zyran guards rushed into the docking bay. "Go, go, go," David shouted. Zyra didn't hesitate. She slammed the controls forward. The ship blasted into the sky. They escaped. For now. What comes next? As the ship soared into the darkness of space, David leaned back, heart still pounding. He turned to Zyra. "So," he said, breathless, "what now?" Zyra's eyes were locked onto the stars ahead. "They will hunt us," she said. "We just made enemies of the most powerful empire in the galaxy." David ran a hand through his hair. "Fantastic." He glanced at her. "And what about us?" Zyra hesitated. "The bond still exists. It will not fade." David sighed. "Great. So not only are we fugitives, we're also permanently stuck with each other." Zyra finally looked at him. For the first time, she smiled. "Now do you understand?" David groaned. This just keeps getting better. Outside, the stars stretched before them. Their journey had only just begun. War and loyalty. The stars stretched endlessly before them, a vast sea of darkness broken only by the faint glow of distant galaxies. The stolen Zyran starship hummed quietly, its controls blinking with alien symbols that David barely understood. He leaned back in the pilot's seat, exhausted but alert, his body still aching from the brutal trial and their narrow escape. Beside him, Zyra sat in silence, her violet eyes scanning the navigation system. Her markings pulsed faintly, reacting to emotions she refused to show. Neither of them had spoken much since they fled the Zyran capital. There was too much left unsaid. Too much they couldn't afford to say. The price of betrayal. David exhaled, breaking the silence. All right, let's start with the obvious. Where the hell are we going? Zyra's grip tightened on the console. We need allies. David raised an eyebrow. Allies? Against the entire Zyran Empire. He let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, good luck with that. Zyra shot him a sharp look. The Council has betrayed its own laws. There are those within our ranks who will not stand for this. David leaned forward. So you're saying there are Zyran who would actually fight against their own empire? Zyra hesitated. Then, for the first time, she looked unsure. Perhaps, she admitted. David sighed, rubbing his face. Fantastic. We're fugitives. We have no plan, no resources, and now we're just hoping some random rebels will decide we're worth saving. Zyra's markings flashed red. Would you rather I had let them execute you? David leaned back, crossing his arms. I don't know. Might have been easier than dealing with you. Zyra's glare could have burned through steel. But before she could fire back, the ship's alarms blared. David and Zyra both turned to the controls. Incoming transmission detected. Zyra's face hardened. She tapped a glowing symbol, and the screen flickered to life. A Zyran commander appeared, a tall, battle-scarred warrior with piercing silver eyes. His expression was unreadable, but his presence radiated authority. Kaxira. His voice was deep, almost reverberating through the ship. You have made a grave mistake. Zyra's jaw tightened. General Valtherus. David frowned. He didn't know much about Zyran politics, but from the way Zyra tensed, he could tell this man was important. You have defied the Council, Valtherus continued. You have abandoned your duty, your people, for a human. His gaze flicked to David, filled with disdain. Your bond has corrupted you. Zyra straightened, her voice sharp. The Council broke its own laws first. David passed the trial. He proved himself. They had no right to sentence him to death. Valtherus exhaled, as if speaking to a foolish child. The Council's duty is to protect the purity of our empire. A human cannot be allowed into our lineage. David crossed his arms. Yeah, well, the bond says otherwise. Valtherus's gaze darkened. The bond is a mistake, and it can still be corrected. Zyra's hand hovered over the weapon controls. We will not surrender. The general didn't react. He simply sighed. I expected more from you, Princess. His silver eyes narrowed. But if you refuse to return, then the Zyran Empire will hunt you as a traitor. The transmission cut off. For a moment, the cockpit was silent. Then, boom! The ship shook violently as an explosion rocked the hull. David grabbed onto the console. Well, that went great. Zyra's fingers danced over the controls. They found us. David glanced at the sensors. 3 Zyran warships. Closing in fast. His stomach twisted. We're so dead. Zyra slammed the thrusters forward. A desperate escape. The ship lurched into motion, streaking through the darkness at impossible speeds. Behind them, the Zyran warships pursued relentlessly, their weapons charging with deadly energy. Brace yourself, Kyra warned. David barely had time to react before the ship dove downward, spinning through an asteroid field. Chunks of rock whizzed past them, some barely missing the hull by inches. The Zyran warships didn't slow down. Energy blasts tore through the asteroids, vaporizing anything in their path. David gritted his teeth. I really hope you know what you're doing. Zyra's eyes flickered with fierce determination. I was raised to fly warships before I could even walk. David exhaled. Great. No pressure. A missile locked onto them. The ship's alarm screamed. David's gut twisted. We can't outrun that. Zyra's fingers flew over the controls. At the last second, she veered the ship directly toward a massive asteroid. David's heart nearly stopped. What are you doing? Zyra didn't answer. The asteroid loomed closer. The missile followed. And at the final moment, Zyra pulled up. The ship barely cleared the surface. The missile, however, didn't. Boom. The explosion ripped through the asteroid, sending shockwaves through space. The Zyran warships diverted course, momentarily blinded by the debris. Zyra seized the opportunity. She punched the ship into hyperspeed. Stars blurred into streaks of light as they shot into the abyss. The Zyran warships vanished from the radar. David exhaled sharply, his hand still gripping the seat. They had escaped. For now. The hidden rebellion. An hour later, the ship drifted into the far reaches of uncharted space. David glanced at Zyra. So, what now? Zyra tapped a new set of coordinates. There's someone we need to meet. David frowned. Who? Zyra finally looked at him. The last general who defied the council. David raised an eyebrow. You mean there's someone else who went against them? Zyra nodded. He was exiled, branded a traitor, but he may be the only one powerful enough to help us. David exhaled. Well, that sounds fun. Zyra's eyes flickered toward the vast unknown ahead of them. You wanted a way to fight back. David smirked. Yeah, I just didn't expect it to involve a galactic civil war. Zyra's lips twitched, the ghost of a smirk forming. Then you better be ready, human. Because the war had only just begun. The final stand, and acceptance. The vast emptiness of space stretched before them, stars twinkling in the distance like ancient watchers. But David wasn't thinking about the beauty of the universe. He was thinking about the war that was coming. Their stolen Zyran starship drifted silently through the void, cloaked by advanced stealth technology. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The cabin lights flickered as Zyra worked over the navigation system, her sharp violet eyes scanning the screen for any signs of pursuit. David sat across from her, arms crossed. Tell me again why this mysterious exiled general is supposed to help us. Zyra didn't look up, because he was the only Zyran to openly defy the Council's rule. He saw the corruption long before I did. He tried to change the Empire, and they branded him a traitor for it. David exhaled. Sounds familiar. Zyra's lips twitched. Yes. Now we share his fate. The ship's console beeped. A signal appeared on the screen. David straightened. Is that him? Zyra nodded. We're here. She entered the final coordinates, and the ship veered toward a hidden space station, nestled within the orbit of a shattered moon. As they approached, the station's security systems scanned them. Then, a voice crackled over the comms. You have 10 seconds to identify yourselves before I blow your ship into debris. David tensed. Great, this was going well already. Zyra leaned toward the speaker. This is Tyra, daughter of the Zyran throne. I seek an audience with General Koreth. A long silence. Then the voice returned, quieter this time. Princess. Tyra's markings pulsed faintly. Yes. Another silence. Then, the station doors opened. The rebellion's last hope. The interior of the space station was dimly lit, its metal walls covered in scars of old battles. Armed warriors lined the corridors, their eyes sharp with suspicion. And at the center of it all, General Koreth. He was massive, even by Zyran standards. His dark silver armor was worn but sturdy, his long white hair tied back in a warrior's braid. His markings, once the proud golden symbols of the Zyran elite, had faded to gray, a sign of exile. His eyes locked onto Xyra. "You have your mother's fire," he said at last. David glanced at Xyra, surprised. She had never mentioned her mother. Xyra inclined her head. "And you have my father's disappointment." Korath chuckled, a deep rumbling sound. "That I do." He folded his arms. "Why are you here, princess?" Xyra's expression hardened. "Because the Empire has fallen into corruption. The Council defies its own laws. They ordered the execution of an innocent man. And now they hunt me as well." Korath's gaze flicked to David, the human. David raised a hand. "Still here, and still confused about why everyone wants me dead." Korath studied him, then turned back to Xyra. "And you wish for me to fight beside you?" Xyra met his gaze. "I wish for you to fight for the truth." Korath was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You truly are your mother's daughter." He turned to the warriors surrounding him. "Prepare the fleet." The Zyran soldiers exchanged stunned glances. One of them hesitated. "General, you swore never to fight again." Korath's eyes burned with new purpose. "I swore never to fight for a corrupt empire. But today, we fight to take it back. The battle for Zyran's future." The rebellion's fleet surged toward the Zyran homeworld, a dark swarm of stolen warships, old battle cruisers, and mercenary vessels. David stood in the command bay, his pulse pounding as he watched the capital city come into view. This was it. Either they won today, or they died as fugitives. Xyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable. David nudged her. "You nervous?" Xyra smirked. "You forget. I was trained for war." David raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, well, I wasn't. So, let's try not to die." Xyra turned to him fully. "We won't die today." David studied her. "You sound pretty sure about that." She held his gaze. "Because if we do, the bond dies with us." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David sighed. "No pressure, then." Xyra's markings flashed red. The war began. The fall of the Council. The first wave of battle was pure chaos. Explosions tore through the city's defenses as the rebellion's fleet engaged the Empire's warships. Fighters zipped through the sky, exchanging blasts of energy fire. On the ground, Zyran warriors, both loyalists and rebels, clashed in brutal combat. David and Xyra fought side by side, pushing toward the council chamber. David ducked under a blade, then slammed the hilt of his stolen weapon into a guard's ribs, sending him sprawling. Xyra moved with lethal precision, her staff cracking against armor, breaking bones, striking with deadly force. They reached the chamber doors just as General Valtheris stepped into view. He held a gleaming energy spear, his silver eyes burning with fury. "You should have stayed hidden, princess." Xyra didn't hesitate. She lunged. The battle between them was fast and brutal. Blades clashed, sparks flew, energy crackled in the air. David watched, heart pounding. Xyra was strong, but Valtheris was stronger. And then, Valtheris feinted left, then struck toward Xyra's heart. David moved before he could think. He threw himself in front of her. The spear sank into his side. Pain exploded through his body. Xyra screamed, "David!" With a roar of fury, she drove her staff into Valtheris's chest, sending him crashing to the floor. David gasped, his vision blurring. He felt himself falling. And then, Xyra caught him. The bond's final test. David lay on the stone floor, blood soaking his shirt. His breathing was ragged. Xyra's face hovered above his, her markings glowing an intense red. "No," she whispered, "you will not die." David coughed, tasting iron. "Not my choice." Xyra gritted her teeth. Then she placed her hands over his wound. A warmth spread through him. The bond flared to life. David's entire body shook as energy surged through his veins. The pain lessened. His vision cleared. When he looked at Syra again, her markings were glowing brighter than ever. His heartbeat matched hers. Their souls were truly bonded. David gasped as the wound closed. He sat up, stunned. What the hell just happened? Zyra's voice was soft. I accepted the bond. David stared at her. You mean, where? Syra nodded. Mates. David exhaled. Well, that's one way to make it official. She smirked. Outside, the battle had ended. The council was overthrown. The war was won. And the new age of Zyran had begun. The beginning of something more. David and Sarah stood on the balcony of the new capital, watching the sunrise. You still sure about this? David asked. Syra turned to him. Sure about what? David grinned. Being stuck with me forever. Zyra's eyes sparkled. The bond chose you. And now, so do I. David exhaled, then smirked. Guess I could get used to this. Zyra smirked back. And as the sun rose over the new empire, their future truly began.